The Holy Gospel according to John, the 6th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So what would it take for us to believe that there is enough? What would it take for us to believe that there is enough in this world? Enough food, enough resources, enough love, enough of each of us? Or maybe there's not actually enough. I've had quite a time wrestling with this whole idea of there being enough as I read the story out of John's Gospel. For these past few weeks, we've been journeying with Jesus and his disciples as they've been at the beginning of their ministry. The disciples are getting their feet wet, being sent out to do that first work that Jesus has commissioned them to do. Jesus' own reputation is beginning to spread among the towns and the countryside, drawing all kinds of people in to hear his teaching, to experience his healing, and to be changed in some way or another. And so here they are, Jesus and his disciples, trying to get away and get a little bit of rest, like we talked about last week, when those crowds again find them. As we hear, there's almost 5,000 of them who have found them, all converging on Jesus and his disciples, all tired from his journey, their journey, all of them ready to eat. So there they are, up on a mountain, away from any type of town, away from any type of place that would have even remotely enough food for that many people, away from any type of food delivery service. And Jesus asked the question of Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people?" I mean, it says that Jesus knew all along what he was going to do, and he was just asking Philip to test him. But it sounded like Jesus was asking Philip how generous are you going to be? That was the test. Would Philip or would any of those disciples there believe that there is enough? So, is there enough? As we heard, and as I'm sure you've known from the past, Jesus went on to feed that multitude of people. That little boy had a few loaves and a couple fish, and Jesus took it and multiplied those things so that everyone would have something to eat. And not just something, but plenty, an abundance to eat. We consider it a miracle that Jesus performed, taking that little bit of food, passing it among those 5,000, and bringing back the leftovers of just baskets full. The writer of John's Gospel called it a sign so that those crowds of people would have further evidence that this person indeed was their prophet. So if we think of all that in the terms of our first question, does that mean that if there is enough in this world, it's a miracle? Maybe. Maybe not. I don't really know. I've heard it said that if everyone in this world would have enough to eat all the time and never go to bed hungry, it would be a miracle. But I've also heard from those who have studied and researched this issue that there is enough food at any one time in this world where every person could be fed. So why is there a gap between these two things? Why is there tons of food going to waste here while there are people going hungry here? And even so, there isn't that much space sometimes between those two things. So maybe a miracle happens when we take the effort to step in and close that gap between excess food and those who need it. I think the same goes for the wealth inequality we face in this world. So much wealth lies with so few people, leaving so many without the means to get by. I think part of the issue is greed. Those times that we fight so hard to gather up as many resources as we can, whether or not we need it. So again, there seems to be enough in this world, but there's again that gap between where the wealth is and where it's needed. This is a bigger issue than politics. It's a bigger issue than those people just need to get jobs. It's an issue of deciding whether or not God does provide abundantly. It's an issue of using what we have for the sake of the world. It's an issue of making sure there is enough. But again, is there enough? So I've said before, and I'll say it again, that there are times when Martin Luther really challenges us and me in how he understands and explains parts of the Creed and the Lord's Prayer and his catechism. So for instance, I had to turn to this when I was thinking about all this. When Luther explains the first article of the Creed, and again, you can find this in the back of your hymnals, page 1162, for those who want to follow along, 1162. But in the first article of the Creed, it says, "I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth." Luther explains this: "I believe that God has created me together with all that exists. God has given me and still preserves my body and soul, eyes, ears, all limbs and senses, reason, and all mental faculties. In addition, God daily and abundantly provides shoes and clothing, food and drink, house and farm, spouse and children, fields, livestock, and all property, along with all the necessities and nourishment for this body and life." That feels hard to hear for someone who's struggling. When it's a chore to make sure we have enough to pay the rent the next month, or when we're constantly wondering where our next meal is coming from, or if we're walking on eggshells because the next hiccup in life can swing you from just making it to not going to make it. And here we have Luther saying, well, God has already provided it all. Is there enough? Well, Luther goes on. If you already shut your book, I'm sorry, 1163. In the Lord's Prayer on the petition of "Give us this day our daily bread," we get two sections from Luther. What does this mean? In fact, God gives daily bread without our prayer, even to all evil people. But we ask in this prayer that God causes us to recognize what our daily bread is and to receive it with thanksgiving. His next question is, what does daily bread mean? Everything included in the necessities and nourishment for our bodies, such as food, drink, clothing, shoes, house, farm, fields, livestock, money, property, an upright spouse, upright children, upright members of the household, upright and faithful rulers, good government, good weather, peace, health, decency, honor, good friends, faithful neighbors, and the like. Is that what it is in the Old Catechism? I don't know, different translations. But there's a lot here, right? Are we promised these things? Is God guaranteeing us all of those things? Is it considered a miracle if we do have them? Or are we missing something if we don't? Is there enough? I want to believe that there is. I have hope that there is. And really, if this gospel story has any indication of it, I think there is. And while Jesus could just do this, perform a miracle, show us a sign, give us what we need in abundance, he asks us first, where would those who need something get it? And when we say, oh, there's no way, Jesus says, yes, there is. What about all those often forgotten stories that we know of in this world? What about those people who take their time and they go and sit on this hard cot and allow someone to stick a needle in their arm and remove a pint of blood so that someone else who desperately needs it can have it? What about the families who have just faced a horrible tragedy, the death of a loved one, and now they're sitting in this cold hospital waiting room discussing with the doctor the possibility of donating organs so that someone else in this world who needs them can get them? What about those mothers who have an overabundance of breast milk and give bags and bags of it away so that other children who need it can have it? Often we can be enough, and sometimes we are the ones with an abundance. But not always, which is why we're called to be generous when we can and share those resources that we have. That's why we can say that there is enough, but there's not enough for everyone if we just do it alone. I believe it's the same answer when we ask if we are enough. Yes, we are enough. But when we don't feel like we're enough, or when we are lacking something, we have others around us who can help us feel like enough. It certainly can feel like hard work to make sure that there's enough of something or of everything in this world to go around for everyone. But really, it's God who makes sure that there's enough. It's God who has created and provides an abundance. It was God who made sure all were fed on that mountainside, and it's God who makes sure all are fed today. But we, as Jesus' disciples, are right alongside God, helping to feed those multitudes. We are alongside God, sharing our abundance and sharing our own resources. So really, what would it take for us to believe that there is enough?